So now we're going to move from lens geometry to what a principal point is, and then how relief distortion relates to that principal point. So let's start out by once again thinking, here's an airplane or some sort of aerial vehicle up here that has a lens associated with a camera on it. And here's the film or the surface on which the image is going to be recorded. And here is the ground down here beneath. So there's going to be one point along the chief ray that starts out at what's called a nadir point, and it goes right up, right through the middle of the lens, does not get bent at all by the lens, and then goes onto the film, let's say, at this one point in the middle of the film here called the principal point. So that principal point is important because there's absolutely no distortion associated with it. It's come straight up, its rays have not been bent, it's passed through the lens, and it's gone right onto the film. However, everywhere else on this image, there's all sorts of distortion that's going on. Part of that distortion is because some paths, like C2, are coming through, they're being bent by the lens, and then they're coming up onto the film. Also, you can see that there's rays here from different geometries. Some are above the elevation of the nadir point. Others are below the elevation of the nadir point, like B1 here. And if we looked at this image, we might believe that B1 was actually coming from a point here, even though it's coming from a point down here. So there's a lot of distortion associated with an image because it's just a 2D representation of this 3D Earth here. But we can do some things to address those distortions. So if we have an aerial photograph, one thing to notice about aerial photographs, historical aerial photographs, is that they have these little markers either on the side of the aerial photograph or on the corner of the aerial photograph. If they're on the corner, there's usually some geometry associated with them, or maybe they're black, but they have a little plus white sign, or white plus sign in the middle of them. And these are called the fiducial marks. These are actually on the camera, and they help us to understand exactly where the principal point is going to be. So if these lines were not there, and we did not know where the principal point was, in this case, we can draw lines from one fiducial mark to the opposite fiducial mark if they're edge marks, or from one corner to the opposite corner if they're on the corners, and then we can find where those lines cross. That's where the principal point is going to be. That's the one point on this aerial photograph where there's going to be no relief distortion. And everywhere else there is going to be relief distortion. So in this case here, they've connected the lines in order to determine the principal point, which is A in this example here. And then anything else, they've just kind of made it a very simple kind of flat land where they have these pegs or towers sticking out of the land. But anything else that has any relief associated with it, whether it's a land or a building or a water tower or a tree or anything else, is going to lean away from the principal point on an aerial photograph. So these things are all leaning away from the principal point. It doesn't matter where they are on the photo. They're always going to lean out from the middle. And we can correct for that, as we'll see, but that does require some additional steps. So this relief displacement is important because you can imagine if the vertical aerial photograph was looking down from here, it would see this area just fine. But now that it's looking off on an angle on the same piece of film, it's actually seeing the top of this building. If it didn't know that that building was that high, it would just project it to this location here. That's where it would look like this point was. And the side of this building, this point here would be in its proper location, and as we go up the building, it would go off more and more to the side. So it would just look like we're kind of looking at that building a little bit from the side, from this direction here, which is why if we look at it from the middle, all of these things are tilted away from the center, away from the principal point. And this is called relief displacement. And once again, we can see it on anything in the image that has any relief associated with it. Vertical things are, of course, easier to see because they happen very quickly. But the land itself can have relief displacement associated with it, or any sort of tower or tree or any other sort of vertical building sides. They'll all have this relief displacement where, once again, everything is displaced away from the principal point. Here's the fiducial marks around the edge here. This is the principal point here. And then all of the vertical things like the trees, things with vertical sides like the trees and the towers and the buildings are leaning away from that principal point. You can just draw a line from the principal point out to the edge of the photograph, and they should follow those lines. And this is an example here of an aerial photograph of Houston, Texas. The principal point is approximately in the middle here, and it's a little harder to tell with the shadows here, but for example, these buildings here are leaning away from the center of the photograph. We can clearly see in some areas like this, and this is the area where most of the tall buildings are. So everything's leaning away from the center of this aerial photograph, and that's the type of effect that this relief displacement creates.